I shared with somebody this week the title of my talk, Evil Shares Our Bed, and someone asked if my wife and I were having trouble. This, of course, did not go over well with my wife, as she thought that this was a negative. Obviously, we had a good laugh about it. No, actually, this title comes from this guy, W.H. Auden, one of my favorite poets. Evil is unspectacular and always human, and shares our bed and eats at our table. So that's the emphasis here. We want to see ourselves as the real issue, the real problem. So I wanted to suggest some caveats to start this. That is, some exceptions to the rule, if you will, about how I'm going to go about this presentation. The first is that this is not my academic field. So my academic field is not a focus on literature necessarily, though that's something that I'm working toward. That's an emphasis that we're anticipating. Literary boundaries. I realize that when we start talking about Gothic literature, and we start talking about the juxtaposition between that and romantic literature, that there's going to be some blurring of the lines, and people may or may not agree with which book fits where. That's really not the focus of this presentation. Our bed emphasizes an application, so I'm really interested in applying what I teach, and the emphasis is always going to be on something that relates to real life. I'm interested in relevancy. I'm also an interdisciplinarian, so you'll see a lot of intersections between a lot of other ideas and a lot of other subjects, especially movies. And then thematic, we will, throughout this particular presentation, do a lot of theme studies, something that I think is important when we think about how do we consider Gothic literature, much less horror. So, a little bit of background so that you understand me, who this person is that's talking with you right now. This was my favorite author in high school. I've actually had people question me as to what's wrong with me when I was a kid. Yeah, Edgar Allan Poe. I like dark things. I was really interested in this kind of literature, so I read everything I get my hands on. Wonderful stuff, Edgar Allan Poe. And then, of course, Alfred Hitchcock. In fact, I still have all of the really cool books. They smell great. They smell musty. I love that smell. It's a great series of books on all of the short stories that Hitch actually put together. I got all of those, just rereading some of them the other night. And of course, he's produced all kinds of films along with this, not the least of which was The Birds, an important movie for lots of different reasons. We don't have time to get into all of that particular emphasis. Rod Serling was somebody that really made a difference in my thinking too. And you have to remember, I'm 61, so that means that when I was in the early 1960s, I was this little kid who was, in those days, you had to dive under your desk. You know, these little particle board desks that somehow were going to prevent you from nuclear fallout. You had to dive under these desks, and we had these drills constantly because everybody was concerned about nuclear holocaust. And so was Rod. Rod was always writing about these kinds of things and showing this in the Twilight Zone. So these mushroom clouds were constantly on his mind and on the minds of all of those who wrote for him, actually. Not the least of which was a guy by the name of Matheson. If you've never read Matheson, I highly recommend him. And this probably is the most terrifying and best of all of the Twilight Zone episodes, I would argue, which is William Shatner, Terror at 20,000 Feet. If you've never seen it, go find it. It's easy to find. Please beware that you will be scared. I'm just telling you right now. It holds up even after all of these years, especially if you're only inches from the screen. You'll get that when you watch it. So the issue of monster is an important issue. Obviously, we want to kind of break down some of the words in the title for this particular presentation. It comes from a word which means warning, and that's an important concept for us. One of the things that we find over and over again is the emphasis on gargoyles. Gargoyles are pretty important as it relates to this because they signify that evil could be present. Now, gargoyles, if you went to some of the great cathedrals or great mansions of European states, you would find these gargoyles everywhere, on roofs, on porticos, even down shafts that go into air settings or air conditioning situations, so that people are reminded that evil is everywhere present. Of course, if you come to my house, please come bearing gifts, And the gifts that you ought to bear are gargoyle gifts. I have gargoyle bookends, I have gargoyle pictures, I have gargoyles everywhere, because I believe evil is actually everywhere present. Then, of course, the word curiosity is important. So when we talk about this, the first thing that automatically comes to anybody's mind who's thought about this at all is the issue of Pandora, opening that famous box. And this from Roger Shattuck from his book, Forbidden Knowledge. Curiosity claims a major role in our lives. At the same time, we have to register limits to our knowledge. And that's really the issue here. The issue in this presentation, the issue in Gothic literature is, how far should we go? And is there a limit to what we should know, much less what we should practice or produce? So I highly recommend Shattuck's book, Forbidden Knowledge, From Prometheus to Pornography. The word unbridled, when I think about this word as I used it in the title, it's an important word to me as it relates to being unhindered, unfettered, in some way let loose. And so we see this in Hyde, for instance. He's initially a disguise that Jekyll uses, but of course loses control of that, as he says, becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worst. By that he means Mr. Hyde. Soon the transformation begins to take place in Jekyll without the drug transfusions, and Jekyll ends up saying that that child of hell had nothing human. This is my true hour of death, knowing that his persona was going to die in relationship to Hyde. Of course, this means that nature, human nature, is corruptible, it's overtaken, it's supplanted, and ultimately it's eradicated. The problem for us is always of our own nature. That's the essence of what I think of when I think about monsters and the issues that we are concerned about as it relates to our presentation tonight. So, the issue of Gothic literature. Gothic literature is important as it relates to the issues of psychology, chaos and disruption, previously located mainly in external forces, in monsters outside of us. Now, the monsters are inside of us. We're produced with the mind of the human subject. And so this concept of psychology connected to horror is an important idea, one that really wasn't present until about the 18th century, but now we see it constantly and everywhere. And so, if you've never seen Psycho, I don't know what's wrong with you. Psycho is one of those tremendously important films that needs to be watched on a regular basis. You will never take a shower in the same way again. Fascinating, of course, how he got Janet Leigh to scream in that episode. He just turned on cold water, which fascinates me by itself. Then there's Anthony Perkins, of course, and this picture of him, and this visage that he has, and then thinking about the end of the film, where we have all of this Freudian psychology kind of dumped on us at the end of this movie, is absolutely fascinating as it relates to the connection between horror and psychology. And so for us, it's really important to make those kinds of connections. Another movie like this that has to do with psychological horror is the movie Identity. And this kind of connects us to Basil's comment in Dorian Gray, where every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. The sitter is merely the accident, he says. The occasion, it's not he who is revealed by the painter. It is rather the painter who, on the colored canvas, reveals himself. So Basil making this particular comment about actually creating that picture for Dorian Gray. If you've not seen Identity, hang on to your seats. It's a wild ride and one that's full of psychological drama. So, I actually teach a course for Indiana Wesleyan University on Gothic world literature. I teach it for a home school group here in Indianapolis, so it's a dual credit kind of course. And I want you to know the 5 books that we look at in particular and help you to understand how I approach them. Just a comment about my pedagogy at this juncture. I'm very much of an activity-driven, discovery-driven instructor, especially as it relates to this level of instruction. So I give students sections of books to read or whole books to read, and then they are to actually write something based on that. And we come to class and discuss it for 2.5 hours, and it's a great way to learn. All of that premised upon the idea that students will actually read the books and write the papers. There you go. So, the first book that we look at is Dracula. even though it was one of the last books that was written in the series of books that I'll mention, Bram Stoker's book. It's the longest. I want them to have that one up front. And then we look at Frankenstein. Frankenstein's are very important. This is the earliest of the books, and so we do this one second. Just heard a great presentation today by John Eller at the Ray Bradbury Center about this particular book as it relates to Ray Bradbury. And then there's Dorian Gray. A picture of Dorian Gray is an important work for lots of different reasons. We'll touch on some of those throughout the presentation. That's our third book. And then the fourth one is Jekyll and Hyde. The strange story of Jekyll and Hyde is the shortest of all of them. And in fact, the one that kind of freaks the students out the most of all of them is that particular work. And then finally, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which has these Gothic overtones to it, even though it really doesn't fit into Gothic horror per se. Nonetheless, these are the books that we highlight and focus our attention on. So, let's talk about what it means to be monstrous as it relates to the title. And this is the monster's view. Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? He appeared at one time a mere scion of the evil principle, and at the other as all that can be conceived of noble and godlike, which of course is all about human dignity. So you see this tremendous emphasis on the human person at once having worth, value, and dignity. That's the monster's view. But hold on, he's not done. This again from chapter 13. For a long time, I could not conceive how one man could go forth to murder his fellow, or even why there were laws and governments. But when I heard details of vice and bloodshed, my wonder ceased, and I turned away with disgust and loathing. For anybody who understands Frankenstein, we understand that the real monster is not the monster, it is Frankenstein himself. And so the problem, of course, is our problem, and that's the emphasis. So we emphasize human depravity in this case. We see this, what many people refer to as a duality of nature between the good and the bad, the depraved and that which is dignified in human beings. Then there's Mary Shelley's introduction to her 1831 work, which is different than the original. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. But here's what she had to say. My imagination unbidden possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. This is speaking about Frankenstein, of course. And this is the emphasis on being unbridled. He is literally unfettered from, or separate from, or loose from any kind of restrictive element for his life. The horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains, looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. I opened mine in terror. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me, and I wished to exchange the ghastly image of my fancy for the realities around. And here we find this emphasis on curiosity, our concern that we are not sure, we have doubts and fears and don't understand fully what's going on with life. And this is Mary Shelley's view of her own creation that she wrote literarily. So, are we drawn to monsters? And I would say yes. There's a whole discussion I would love to get into about the importance of eyes and how powerful eyes are. But this is one snapshot of one piece of Dracula where we find this person of Mina, if you've read the story. And we know that she's a good woman. Not just good, but she's good, according to the text. And Dracula literally forces her to drink his blood from a gaping wound in his own chest. And she, in response, says, strangely enough, I did not want to hinder him. Now, think about the implications for that. Not only is this insidious in many ways, but the idea that somehow she would not be put off by this, even though she's really the good one in the story. How does that work? Are we really closer to monsters than we think? And then, of course, there's the three female vampires. Things get really interesting here. There was something about them, Parker says, that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. Wow, talk about an enticement, talk about something that is kind of over the top, but nonetheless there it is. And this emphasis of our own problem, our own nature is really the issue here. So we have this curiosity, this fascination. We're drawn to that which is monstrous. And here Harker says, I am all in a sea of wonders. I doubt, I fear, I think strange things, which I dare not confess to my own soul. The man is torn. He doesn't know which way to go. And this constant struggle with the evil that he sees, not necessarily outside of him, but actually within himself, is the real issue. Now, if there's anybody who's virtuous in this book, Dracula, it's the townspeople, in my estimation. It's in chapter 1. And where we find Harker actually going to Dracula's castle, and the townspeople are really desperately trying to get him to not go. And then when he continues on his way, they begin to give him crucifixes and wooden stakes and all kinds of things to ward off evil. And this is a very traumatic time. The townspeople actually understand the evil. They see it for what it is. They get it, even though nobody's listening. But I think what's really fascinating about this, and it's not really given much play in the book, it's just kind of stated, but I think it's this undertone, and that is the difference between the country and the city. I think people in the country have a little bit more sense, if you will, a little bit more wisdom, perhaps, a little bit more understanding of what evil might actually be. Because when you find Dracula in London, everybody goes about their business, nobody really cares, there's not really much of any kind of imposition on the people. They don't think one way or the other about it. And so I think this is an important idea, something to consider for future discussion, perhaps. Chapters 6 and 7 really kind of grab my attention in Dracula. You've got the old man who gives this very eerie preachment, and then, of course, the captain who sermonizes, actually, in chapter 7, literally as he's going down with the ship, as it were. He's heard from again, but only in his own funeral. The difficulty, of course, of this is that you see these men that are standing against evil. They see it for what it is. Really, the writer's trying to get you to understand that this might be problematic, and of course, that's not the way everybody sees it. So, something else to consider for all of Gothic literature, but here in Dracula is just one example of this, is the concept of what does it mean to be an outlier in literature. Those people that are outside the story, a part of it, but not really intricately invested within it. What do they mean, and are they important, and why might they be important to the story, and could they tell us something that the rest of the people in the story really don't understand? And then, of course, there's Renfield, who says, I am no lunatic and a mad fit, but a sane man fighting for his soul. Here is the man who's literally straitjacketed, because Dracula has him. He has literally incorporated this man and taken him. Van Helsing says all men are mad in some way or another. I kind of think that's one of the low points of any comments that Van Helsing makes in the book. But then see where it says, perhaps I shall gain more knowledge out of the folly of the madman than I shall from the teaching of the most wise. Because here's this person who literally is being abused by this Dracula person and understands what it means to know horror. And yet, nobody seems to be listening. So, perhaps a commercial break. One of the pieces that I've contributed to is this book called Science Fiction and the Abolition of Man, the second chapter in this particular book. And the title of my chapter is The Monster in the Mirror. The subtitle is The Problem with Technology is the Problem with Us. And what I emphasize in this book, which is really a book that takes on, I think there are 35 contributors to this volume, and we all take something out of science fiction that we really love and then consider it in light of C.S. Lewis' famous educational work, The Abolition of Man, which is really a fascinating study by itself. So my conclusion about technology is this: technology does not change us as much as we change technology, so we don't have to change. That's my contention. Honestly, I think that our constant issue with the newest iPhone is really not about Apple, it's about us. We really don't want anything else that we have to think about in any straightforward manner. We love distraction. We love to be outside of whatever the discussion might be. We don't really want to stay on course. And so the monster in the mirror is all about the problem of technology, but really the problem is us. So some other universal themes that we see in pieces like this throughout Gothic literature. Jekyll and Hyde, of course. When you have Robert Louis Stevenson, who comes from Scottish roots, also a Calvinistic background, religiously speaking. He created what he called crawlers, which I think is a fascinating title for the kinds of works that he did. This is one of those that he refers to this way, The Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde. But what was fascinating is, as I read about his background and so on, is that he was creating books that people were reading that people usually didn't read. So maybe in order to get people to read, even during those particular periods of time, those years, here's a guy who was making fiction so that people would read something interesting. There are lots of examples of the Jekyll and Hyde theme. Here's just one. If you haven't seen Mr. Brooks with Kevin Costner and William Hurt, I highly recommend it, just for the sense of seeing, literally seeing, the duality of person, the evil person as well as the Jekyll who's trying to stay clean. He actually recites the Alcoholics Anonymous piece all the way through this particular film because he's wanting to come clean, as it were, not from alcohol, but from this sinister person who's literally invaded his life. Universal themes, that's an important concept when we talk about Gothic literature. So physiognomy, criminologists during these days when Jekyll and Hyde was written, literally utilized what they referred to as a science to explain criminal behavior based on somebody's physical appearance. And so one of the things I think that was taking place during the time Stevenson was writing his book was this kind of science, as it were, but he was using it then to display Hyde in a way that made him very disfigured and alienated from everybody else in the book. Highly recommend at least a little bit of understanding about that as you think about dealing with Jekyll and Hyde. Then there's the idol. This is a word that's used frequently in this particular little volume. It's fascinating to me that this is the word that's actually used. You'll see it here. Jekyll actually says that ugly idol in the glass, this was myself, natural and human. This was early in the book, before literally he was being overtaken or overcome by Hyde himself. Now, there's a story to tell about this. I worked with a very fine literature professor in Chicago when I taught there, and she actually had a course on Monstrous. That was the title of the course. And when she taught the course the very first time, she had them watch the 1941 version of Jekyll and Hyde, starring Spencer Tracy. Well, this was over a weekend, and so when she came back on Monday and asked the students about this particular viewing, this showing, they said, we had to stop the movie, we couldn't watch it. Now, here are young people who have grown up with what I call torture porn, the Saw series, and you have this whole thing going on in their lives. They've seen all kinds of massacres and awfulness throughout life in reality as well as on screen, and yet they couldn't take the transformation of Jekyll to Hyde that you see in Spencer Tracy. I mean, this is old technology, 1941. And they were scared. And so the professor said, well, why was it that you were so afraid? And they said, get this now, it seemed so real. Oh, how about that? It seemed so real. So, a few statements about idolatry and specifically about idols. Here are 5 statements from my perspective. I think idols serve a source by which we receive our knowledge, so we get our information from this. Idolatry, by the way, can come in various forms. It can be political idolatry. It can be media idolatry. If you, let's say, bow to the totem of NPR and the New York Times, there are certain kinds of sources that you're getting that other people might just say, you know, this is really not anything you ought to read or watch. The source of things matters. And then there's the standard by which we judge or interpret it, through which we see. We're looking through these lenses at our life around us or at life around us. Then there's the self, by which we decide for ourselves what will be our interests and our place in life. So literally, this overtakes us, and we're consumed by it in that sense of things. Idols then give us significance by which we estimate our worth and our value. So we begin to compare and contrast ourselves with whatever it is that we think is very important. And then finally, it's the security by which we trust and we depend on our future and hope and confidence in all of this. And so this concept of idolatry literally has these 5 concerns: the source, the standard, the self, the significance, and the security, whereby we are going to function in our lives. And I see that not only coming through Jekyll and Hyde, but through all of these books. These personages become these idols. So, Unbridled Curiosity leads to the Monstrous. Ursula Le Guin, science fiction writer, has said that a scientist who creates a monster or a wizard unable to cast a spell may be precise and profound metaphors of the human condition. The fantasist or technologist may be taking as seriously as any sociologist and a good deal more directly about human life as it's lived, and it might be lived, and as it ought to be lived. And her point, of course, is that science fiction sometimes is a better teacher than some of the other humanities that we depend upon for our teaching. So, about halfway through this presentation, I thought I'd offer some questions. How do ethical boundaries limit curiosity, if at all? Do we have ethics that we have set up for ourselves that say, we're going to accept this knowledge, but not that knowledge? Number 2, what, if any, is the interplay between human concepts of theology and psychology? Is there an engagement between our understanding of who God might be, whoever you deem God to be, and then this idea of who we ourselves are? And is there any crossover? And is there a connection to monster in this? 3, is it possible, if at all, to be progressively conservative in our approach to life, living the tension between good and evil? Do we see this kind of tension instead of the yin-yang, balanced 50-50 of life, to actually literally see it as a tension and suggest that both of these things are true at the same time, and it indeed is a battle? Number 4, how do these stories prompt our understanding of human nature? How do we consider ourselves as human beings? Are monstrous literary creatures a result of or a warning against upending order? That's a whole discussion by itself. The importance of order and the necessity of that, and lots of important writers have taken this up. And then number 6, do we take responsibility for our creations? This is, of course, something that resonates all the way through the book Frankenstein and his concerns about actually taking out the monster at the end of the book. So, Alexander Pope, Essay on Man, this is what he said. Vice is a monster of so frightful mien as to be hated needs but to be seen. So vice and villainy may provide visible warnings, prompting virtuous behaviors. This, I think, is important for us as we consider how we think about these kinds of books. Some people are really put off by vice and villainy, and they think, why should we be reading books like this? I could tell you many, many stories of the parents that I've had to deal with through all of my years of education. All of the parents that were upset with me for one reason or another, and it always had to do with what I was filling the students' minds with. All I was doing was actually sharing with them the realities of life and then having them ask questions about how does this apply. Parents sometimes didn't see it that way. Especially this was true with movies. Folks get a little hinky about showing film, and there are some good reasons for that, of course, but nonetheless, the issue of showing vice as a positive because it actually demonstrates virtue is really what this is all about. A really cool little story that Dostoevsky tells about the old woman and the onion is probably apropos at this moment. There is a story about an angel who goes before God, and he says, the old woman has died. She's been a nasty old woman all of her life, but I really would like to see her in heaven. And God says, is there anything that would give her positive? Or did she do anything good during her life? And the angel said, well, she grew onions, and every once in a while she would share these onions with her neighbors. And God said to the angel, well, then take an onion and take it down to the fiery pit of hell and offer it to the woman. And if she takes hold of the onion and you pull her out, then she can come to heaven. So the angel does as he's been instructed. He offers the onion to the old woman. She grabs hold with zest and vitality. And of course, as she's being pulled out of hellfire, so everybody else wants to be pulled out as well. And what does the old woman do? She begins to kick them away and says, "This is my onion." At which point, the onion breaks and she falls back into hellfire. The issue of showing the villain demonstrates the opposite, the virtuous nature of life. Now, I'd like to suggest a prophetic role for literature, and I don't mean this by a foreshadowing of something yet to come. I mean prophecy in the sense that there's a forthtelling of something. Not foretelling, but forthtelling. So Franz Kafka said this: "If the book we are reading does not wake us, as with a fist hammering on our skull," I love that metaphor, "why then do we read it? A book must be an ice axe to break the sea frozen inside of us." If these books matter not at all, if these books are simply some kind of a pablum that gives us a sweet treat of what it means to see a villain or experience vice, then we've missed it altogether. I think Kafka really had a point here, and that is that the book actually ought to be something that smacks us upside the head and breaks the inner logjam of ice within our own cold hearts so that we begin to see ourselves differently. So there are lots of new monsters out there, and this is one of them. Venom has just come out on the big screen, so if you're at all interested in such things, check this out. The world, as you notice there, is tired of superheroes. I might also add, so am I. I'm kind of tired of seeing all the movies about superheroes, so it's kind of nice to see an anti-hero. But one of the problems with the anti-hero are at least two ideas. One is ethical autonomy. One of the key concerns of this venomous creature is not that he will only do bad to bad people, but he will do bad to whomever he thinks he wants to do bad to. And then ultimately, he is liberated from all authority. So no one tells him what to do. The problem with any anti-hero goes a long way to have another discussion about another topic of interest. So, what else can we learn about the monsters? Well, there's zombies, and of course, if you are at all interested in these kinds of horror flicks, you know George Romero very well. Dawn of the Dead, his movies about zombies are really important, I think. The concept of materialism and uncontrolled appetite was always a key concern for him. This is something that you'll see over and over and over again in zombie movies, and George Romero is really the father of them all, in many respects. So, what are some of the results of unbridled curiosity? I'd like to suggest 10. Here's 5 at least. A little fear of consequence. I think some of us run into what I call the normalcy bias. That is, things are fine. We look outside. We're not dodging AK-47 fire. There's no RPGs being fired at us in this particular room. Everything is good. That's normalcy bias. We just think things will continue as they are. And we're always surprised when they turn up the opposite. There's a constant desire for release from restriction. So whenever we see this within these books, we also see this within ourselves. There's an internal longing for the forbidden. We've seen some of this in some of the offerings that I've suggested here this evening. There's an outside warning that's being refused. So if you just take the idea of the townspeople, for instance, who were telling this person who wants to go visit Dracula, you shouldn't go. And if you do, here's a bunch of crucifixes and wooden stakes to take with you. Those warnings are refused. And then there's scientism. And actually Van Helsing speaks to this. It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all. And if it explain not, then it says that there's nothing to explain. Wow. That means that science is all. Well, that's not true, of course. We all know that. But nonetheless, that ISM ending kind of sets us in the wrong direction. Certainly set folks like Frankenstein in the wrong direction. I'd like to pick up on a couple of those themes, the first of which is this little fear of consequence. When two objects collide, there's always damage of a collateral nature. This is Professor Moriarty in The Game of Shadows versus Sherlock Holmes. If you've seen that series, wonderful stuff there, some really fine movie making. But I put an asterisk next to the word consequence, because I do believe that consequence necessitates a fear. That is, it requires forethought. You need to think through whatever it is that you're going to do before you do it, so as to stay away from the negative consequences that might befall you. Consequences continue. Professor Moriarty was right. When two objects collide, there's always damage of a collateral nature. We make decisions. We formulate choices. We create laws. We follow politicians. We construct policies. We craft economies. And we live with the consequences, intended or not. Now, there's an awful lot to chew on there, but every single one of us deals with this. Every single one of us makes decisions in every aspect of our lives. We're coming up into a political season. We see it constantly all around us. We can't wait till November 7th when we don't have to watch those ads on television any longer. But the whole point of this is that we will make a choice, and we will have to live with whatever choice it is that we make. So consequences are consequences. Dorian says, attempts that he wanted to escape from himself, literally. There's a really fine movie called The Butterfly Effect where it takes on this concept of consequence. The attempts to reverse course, to change outcomes, even if it were possible, reverberate with Gothic horror all the way through. You see this in these particular books. The consequences are always there. I would also suggest that we create monsters, and we create them in lots of different ways. During the 1990s, actually 1995 as I recall, I was reading this book, Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton's famous work, to students as we were discussing ethics in high school classes. And then on opening night, I took 25 of them to opening night to watch Jurassic Park with me. The emphasis on reading the book and then seeing the movie. But the key to the whole book, Michael Crichton's biggest concern, is the question is not can we, but should we? And I would offer that anytime we utter the word should, we are automatically emphasizing an ethical code, an ethical system. We have already decided in ourselves what is right and wrong for us. Unintended Consequences. This is a film by Guillermo del Toro. I'll talk more about him in a moment. But the unintended consequences in this film is fascinating. There are scientists who are trying to eradicate some awfulness in life, and then, unintended consequence, something else turns up afterwards. And that's the main issue here that we have to deal with in life. So, Frankenstein, learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. This is in chapter 4. He should have listened to this statement, by the way, that he gave of it for himself. He should have listened to this all the way through. Obviously, he did not. So, results of unbridled curiosity, here are 5 more. There are apocalyptic visions all the way through this particular piece. In fact, all of the 5 books. And when I say apocalyptic, I mean not simply some portent of awfulness yet to come, but I mean what the Greek word means, which is a revelation, an uncovering of things. Then we have this lack of internal controls that runs all the way through these books. Not the least of which is a statement like this from Tacitus, the Roman historian, who said, "A corrupt society shows itself by the multiplicity of its laws." So the idea that if we have more and more laws, the problem isn't outside, the problem's inside. See, if you can't control yourself, you need somebody else to control you. And therefore, the more laws demonstrates the lesser amount of control you have within. That's Tacitus. Disregard of history, I'll speak more about this in just a moment. The usurpation of the eternals, time-space boundaries are problematic here. And I would suggest, by the way, that any science fiction film that deals with time travel is indeed trying to overcome really the last difference, the last hurdle between us and God. Again, whoever you may deem that to be, because if you are eternal, then indeed you have crossed that Rubicon. You have now become that great person. You have become a God yourself. And then finally, the attempt toward completion, and we'll mention this again in a moment. So, a word about history. This movie, Magnolia, says this statement over and over again. We may think we're done with history, but history is not done with us. So this actually pops up in Dorian Gray in chapter 16. In her dealings with man, destiny never closed her accounts. What a statement that is about the issues of history and the importance of what it means to actually think through what happened before that's going to drive me to think about how I should live my life now. Actually, I had a high school student ask me this week. Do any of these novels provide answers to escape from the beast? And in this case, we were talking about Dr. Moreau. My response is what I've suggested earlier. This from Dr. Moreau. To this day, I've never troubled about the ethics of the matter. Here's a guy who's literally taking animals and human beings and bringing them together, making them one, and creating these awful beasts in his book. And he doesn't think that there's any ethical problem here. There's no right or wrong. There's no concern that he has. And I would go back to the virtue versus villainy issue, which of course is actually a theory in literature. How about that? Virtue theory. So the virtue theory comes out of Aristotle. The ethic of character, not duty. So this thing that is born within us, the building up of the interiority of the person is of necessity here. And so if you don't have that, you're going to need those external controls because you can't control yourself. And then the virtue theory continued through Aquinas as he talked more about the affective, again, that coming from within. If you don't take care of what is coming from within, then you will need those external controls. So I mentioned earlier, as we started this, the emphasis on interdisciplinarity. And I would just like to suggest these areas, and I'm just putting them up on a screen for now, and maybe we'll talk about a few of them. But I wanted to say to everybody that when we talk about Gothic horror or literature or anything that has to do with anybody's communication of their belief, that there is an intersection with these major topics. Mythology, of course, the origin of something, axiology having to do with ethics, psychology, philosophy, thanatology, which is the study of death. That is, how do we think properly about death, whether it be our own or somebody else's, or that which we look forward to or we don't look forward to. Theology, technology, cinematography, and interdisciplinarity. Cinematography is one of those things that's really kind of near and dear to my heart. I wrote another book on that, When the Lights Go Down, which is a book about movies and how to watch film in a way that might be beneficial. I believe that real evil does exist, and a movie like Solomon Kane actually gets after that. This is, again, one of those movies that probably isn't very well known, but actually is really pretty good. And you can watch it for free, and you can even get the DVD extras. It's a pretty good film to watch. Real evil exists. And then, of course, we have some great books that focus on dystopian literature versus utopia. Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, Animal Farm, all of these ideas in these books are making us think we need to stand up in dissidence against those who would want to force themselves on us in one way or another. And it's important for us to recognize that this is part of our responsibility. Sometimes we find books that actually changed our vocabulary. So 1984, Uglies, The Running Man, or The Chrysalids bring vocabulary, new vocabulary that we didn't have before. But now we say all the time, Big Brother is watching, or Newspeak, or the reality TV, or tolerance. All of those terms came out of science fiction books, which I always find fascinating and a wonderment that these kinds of books have had such a tremendous influence on this culture. Then there's mythology. In the ancient Near Eastern world, monsters were aberrations of the gods. Great cosmic clashes existed between monster gods. Movies like Alien versus Predator are the same as Marduk versus Tiamat of the ancient Enuma Elish myth. So if you're into the Alien series, you understand those kinds of movies literally have this, or foretasted, thought by these ancient writings in the Babylonian epics. In the Enuma Elish, water and darkness are both seen as forces of chaos. Chaos is personified by Tiamat, the ancient Near Eastern creation story. Chaos is a menace. So-called gods need to tame her. So then we come to the issue of cinematography. Talk a little about mythology. Here's cinematography. Guillermo del Toro, again, did a movie like Hellboy. He's done a lot of films. This is just one of those where you have some of these creatures that have human elements and also supernatural skills. And he says, when you read any of these great fairy tales, be it Oscar Wilde or Hans Christian Andersen, they all have a very strong element of pathos. The best way to address these little truths is in fables. So one of his fables was the one that almost killed him. It was one of the films that I've rarely seen where the director actually starts his film in the first 30 to 60 seconds telling you that he almost died making this movie and lost 40 pounds in the process. And it was quite a traumatic experience for him. It was his signature film. So in the movie, Mercedes the maid is asked if she believes in fairy tales. I used to when I was young, she said, I used to believe in a lot of things I no longer believe in. And then there's this quick segment, a quick transition. Disbelief is immediately countered by a funeral scene where the mystery of God's work in a broken world is explored. Moviegoers will question what was real, the world or the fairy tale, and the response is both. They both are real. So here's Guillermo del Toro. When you have the intuition that there is something which is there but out of the reach of your physical world, art and religion are the only means to get to it. How do you explain supernatural events? How do you engage horror? How do you think about these things without art and without religion? Solzhenitsyn said it this way: the line separating good and evil passes not through states or between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. I remember reading Gulag Archipelago when I was a teenager, and remember reading that particular line and thinking that the problem isn't parties, the problem isn't systems, the problem isn't politics or policies, the problem is me. And then there's this great line from Czesław Miłosz, one of my favorite poets: those who are alive receive a mandate from those who are silent forever. Those of us who continue to teach, those of us who continue to write, those of us who continue to speak, are doing so because others have died and cannot speak. And that's Milosz's point. He was one of these survivors of the awfulness of the Nazis during World War II, and did some tremendous poetry. I highly recommend his works. Some final thoughts. My curiosity about curiosity reveals my own goblins, specters, ghosts, and demons. I have my own problems. So do you. Some of what lingers in the dark, I think, is meant to stay there. Some of it we shouldn't deal with. So it may surprise you, maybe not, that I don't watch horror movies, because I know that demonic substance is too real, and therefore not something that I want to have on my mind. Our goodness does not spring from our godness. One of the great themes, I think, that comes out of all of these books that we've suggested. A great little piece of poetry, Edna St. Vincent Millay: upon this gifted age in its dark hour rains from the sky a meteoric shower of facts. They lie unquestioned, uncombined. Wisdom enough to leach us of our ill is daily spun, but there exists no loom to weave it into fabric. There's no completion, there's no coherence, and there's a desperate desire for this, not just for all of us or the whole world, but for all of these books. If you haven't read this little short story, H.G. Wells' The Answered Prayer, I highly recommend it. It'll take you about 10 minutes. And the whole point is summarized here. A vicar who puts on the vestments every week, but is not vested in his heart, is terrified when God shows up. I highly recommend a reading of this little piece. H.G. Wells was no friend of the church, but he certainly took the church to task, as he should have and did, and certainly said some things that, for those of us who care, should wake us up. I'm concerned that we become what we hate. Friedrich Nietzsche, my favorite atheist, wrote, in Beyond Good and Evil, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. I have started using The Mist, a Stephen King novella, as an experiment in showing college students. So college students come to my home. I have this really nice 4 by 7 foot projection screen television with leather seats. You want to come, let me know, we'll set up a time. And I show college students The Mist. It's really fascinating. It's tremendously terrifying at places. It's aliens, and all of the bloodletting that aliens do. But every single time, college students can't handle it.